my with my session today, and I welcome you to this session on system databases in SQL Server. And today I'll be telling you about what are different system databases that are used in SQL Server. So our today's session would be a kind of practical session, and also I will tell you some of the logic and the theory behind different SQL Server databases. When we talk about system databases in SQL Server, primarily there are there are 6 types of different system databases in SQL Server, and these are master database. Then we have MSDB database. We have model database. We have temp database. And these 4 are those databases that are quite popular because you can see when you open your SQL Server Management Studio, and under system databases, you are able to see all these 4 databases. But apart from this, there are 2 other databases that are also categorized as system databases and that are very important. And these are the resource database. Resource database, it is a read-only database that contains system objects. And then there is a distribution database. And this distribution database is relevant in the context of SQL Server application. When you set up transactional application, it will create a distribution database either on the same machine where you have set your publication, or on a remote machine where you have set up your remote distribution. And for Azure SQL database and Elastic Pool, only master database and temp databases are available. If you go into the description of these databases, master database records all the system level information for an instance for the SQL Server. Model database is used by SQL Server agent for scheduling alerts and jobs. And actually, MSDB is also sometimes called as SQL Server agent database. Model database is used as a template for all databases that are created on the SQL Server instance, and modifications made to the model database such as database size, database collation, recovery model, and other database options are applied to any database that would be created afterwards. So you can say that model database is actually used as a template for creating new databases. Temp database is also a very important database in the context of system databases, and it is a workspace for holding temporary objects or intermediate results that are generated by the SQL queries. And resource database is a read-only database that contains system objects that are included with SQL Server. What actually happens in SQL Server is that under each SQL Server database, all the system objects are physically present in the resource database, but they logically appear in the sys schema of every database within the SQL Server. And I will give you a demo of it when I will be showing you how does it work. So if we move to the master database, the master database records all system level information for a SQL Server. This includes instance-wide metadata such as login accounts, endpoints, linked servers, and also the system configuration settings. In SQL Server, system objects are no longer stored in the master database. Instead, they are stored in the resource database. And master is the database that records the existence of all other databases and the location of their data files and also the transactional log files. It records the initialization information for SQL Server, and this is the reason that SQL Server, that master database, is very important for SQL Server at the time of restart, because SQL Server will not start and it will not work if the master database is not available. If we talk about different permissions on master database, by default, all users that have access to the SQL Server instance, they have the select permission on the master database. And this select permission is granted on the behalf of a public database role that is assigned to every user in a SQL Server. And the select permissions, they can be denied for any user as it is the case for a regular database, or even the public database role can be revoked from the users. Even it is possible to create user objects in the master database, but it is not a recommended practice to do so. And the master database should stay as static as possible. For example, in the case of master database being rebuilt, all the user objects would be lost. Therefore, as a DBA, it would be a very good practice that you do not allow end users to create objects in the database, or you deny the public database role to the users. As far as backups is concerned, it is recommended to have regular backups of master database. This master database is very crucial at the time when the SQL Server becomes unusable. And usually changes in the master database only occur when there are changes in the system objects, like if you add, change, or delete logins, or if you modify your endpoints and make changes to your link servers. In those situations, it is critical to take a backup of the master database. And the change in the master database can also be caused by the changes in the SQL Server instance configuration or an SQL Server patch that you have applied. And when any of these changes occurs, it is a recommended practice to perform a backup of the master database. Now, before we come to the restrictions, I will give you a demo of what we can do with different system databases and what we cannot. So this is uh, my virtual machine in Azure that is running SQL Server on it, and I'm connecting to it using SQL Server Management Studio. Perfect. So here you can see that if I go to the databases, this is my bike store is my user database, but if I go to the system databases, I'm able to see the master database, model database, MSDB database, and temp database. And if I try to do different operations, like for example, in the case of master database, if I try to drop the database, it will not allow me to drop the master database. And if I say drop database master, and I try to execute it, you see that I get an error that says that cannot drop the database master because it is a system database. So I cannot drop my master database. Similarly, if I try to set my master database to be offline, again, it will not allow me to do so. So if I say alter database master, set offline, then you see that it gives an error saying that option offline cannot be set in a database master. So I cannot set my master database to be offline. Similarly, if I try to rename my master database, I will also not be able to do so. So if I say alter database master and I say modify name to be master DB. If I try to do this, you can see that it is giving me an error saying that cannot change the name of the system database master. So I cannot change the name of my system database. Similarly, if I try to change the database owner, I will not be able to do so. So if I say, so I have to set the context to the master database. And once my context is set, then I need to say that I need to call a stored procedure called exit sp change db owner. It's called change db ow. Okay. Exit sp change db owner. If this is the stored procedure I'm going to call, and I want to change the database owner to be Uzair. It will not allow me to do so. It does not take is equal to. That's how it should execute. So I cannot change the owner of the master database or other system databases. Similarly, if I want to do the change data capture, again, this is something that I cannot do. So in order to do the change data capture, I need to call a stored procedure called exit sp change data capture enable db. Yes, this one. So if I try to execute this, it gives an error that says that could not enable change data capture for database master. Change data capture is not supported on system databases or on a distribution database. Similarly, there is a guest user in system database. If you go to security users, and here you can see that there is a guest user. And if I try to drop this guest user, it will also not allow me to do so. So if I say that drop user guest, this one, and I try to execute it, cannot disable access to the guest user in master database or in temp database. So you can see that there are a number of operations in master database that are not allowed because those operations are restricted with reference to the this SQL Server master database. So I'm going back to my presentation. So here you can see that there are different restrictions for the master database, and some of them, apart from the others that I have told, is that you cannot add files or file groups to the master database. Backups, as far as the backups are concerned, you can only take a full backup of the master database. You also cannot change the database collection, and the database collection of a SQL or some master database will determine the database collection of the SQL Server instance. You cannot change the database owner, and master database is actually owned by the SA database, SA user. So here, SA user is actually the owner of the objects within the master database. Going back to my presentation. Similarly, we cannot create triggers of the system tables in the master database, and you cannot create a full text catalog or a full text index on a master database. And as I have given you a demonstration, it was not possible to drop the master database to drop the guest users in the database. Similarly, it is also not able to do the change data capture. Your master database cannot be part of a mirroring solution, and you cannot remove the primary file group from the data file or from the primary data file, or you cannot, or from a log file. And renaming the database or primary file group is also not possible. And I have given you a demo that it was not possible to set the master database to be offline. And you cannot set the database or primary file group of master database to be read-only. So these are some of the restrictions that are relevant for a master database. When we talk about MSDB, it is also called as the SQL agent database. And the MSDB database is used by SQL Server agent for scheduling alerts and jobs, and by other features such as SQL Server Management Studio, SQL Broker, and also for the service broker, and also for the database mail. SQL Server automatically maintains the complete online backup and restore history within the tables in MSDB database. And the MSDB database is also used to store information about all the backups and restores that have been executed on an SQL Server instance, no matter if they are executed by SQL agent, job, or they are executed by SQL Server Management Studio, SQL CMD utility, or any other application. MSDB will keep track of all related operations. By default, MSDB uses the simple recovery model. And if you use the backup and restore history tables, then it is recommended that you should use the full recovery model for MSDB, because in simple recovery model, you will not be able to recover the objects if the recovery model is set to simple and you are using the backup and restore history tables within MSDB. When SQL Server is installed or upgraded, or whenever setup.exe is executed, or it is used to rebuild the system databases, then the recovery model of MSDB is automatically set to simple. So this is a very important point as a DBA that you have to remember, that if you are upgrading the SQL Server, or you are rebuilding the system databases, and you have set the MSDB recovery model to be full, then after these operations, the recovery model of MSDB will be set back to the default, and the default model is simple recovery model. MSDB is one particular important thing about MSDB is that it is the only system database that has predefined database roles beside the fixed database roles. And beside the member of the sysadmin fixed server roles that are able to perform any operations on the instance of SQL Server, only members of these database roles will also be able to perform different jobs. For example, if you grant SQL agent role, SQL agent reader role, or SQL agent operator role to any user, then those users will be able to interact with the SQL Server agent in your database instance. Similarly, if you grant a database mail user role to a user, then that user will be able to send emails from the SQL Server. And these database roles that are specific to MSDB are relatively important when you are designing the security model of your SQL Server database instance. Now, if we talk about permissions, like any other system database, it is not recommended that the user should be able to create user objects within the MSDB database. And by default, users will not have access to the MSDB database. And if you provide access to the users in MSDB database, then it is recommended to use the predefined database roles that I have already explained in my previous slide. One thing that you need to remember is that a user that does not have access to MSDB database will not be able to see the SQL Server agent from the SQL Server Management Studio. And the MSDB database is default configured for a simple recovery model. But if for some reasons you decide to change it for a full recovery model, then do not forget to add the respective transaction log backup jobs for the MSDB backup. And a change in MSDB database normally occurs when either you are creating, modifying, or deleting SQL Server agent jobs, you are taking backup and restore of any existing database in the SQL agent in the MS SQL instance, or you are doing some SQL Server native replication tasks. So under those conditions, it is recommended to take the backup of MSDB database. Normally, MSDB database, backup of MSDB database should be a part of your regular SQL Server backup, because this database is very important when we are performing the restore. Otherwise, the MSDB database will become unusable. Now, as far as different restrictions are concerned, I will go back to the instance of the SQL Server so that we could practically see that what are the different things that we cannot do with the SQL Server MSDB database. And let's try to repeat most of these operations for the MSDB database. So let me copy them from here so that we could reuse them, and we put them here for MSDB. So if I try to drop my MSDB database, I will not be able to do so because it is a system database, and again it will complain that you cannot drop the MSDB database. If I try to set my MSDB database to be offline, this is again something that I cannot do because it is a system database and it cannot be offline. So option offline cannot be set in a database MSDB. Similarly, if I try to rename the SQL Server database, the MSDB database, I will not be able to do so. So if I say that I'm trying to rename the database, it will give an error that it is not possible to change the name of a system database MSDB. Similarly, if I try to change the if I try to do a change data capture on the MSDB database, again this is something that I cannot do. For example, let me go here, and I want to execute it in the context of MSDB. So if I say that, and here you can see that I cannot change the data CDC for database MSDB because it is not allowed to change the database capture for MSDB. Similarly, if I try to change the database collation, if I try to change the owner for database MSDB, this is again something that I cannot do. It will not allow me to change the database owner for MSDB. And if I try to change the database collation of my MSDB database, again, this is something that I will not be able to do so. If I say alter database MSDB correlate to, if I say French, case insensitive and accent sensitive. You see that I cannot alter the database MSDB because it is a system database, and this is the reason that since I cannot alter it, I cannot change the database collation. And I would like to know that what is the database collation currently set for the MSDB database. I can query it from sys.databases, DMV. This will tell me the database collation for my different databases. So if I execute this, and here you can see that currently the database collation for all my system databases is set to SQL Latin 1 General CP1 CIAS. So I am going back to my slides to figure out what are the limitations for the uh, MSDB. So I can see that it is not possible to change the database collision. It is not possible to drop the MSDB database. Dropping the guest user from the database is also not possible. Similarly, changing the uh, change data capture is also not possible. We can MSDB, it cannot perform in database mirroring, and I cannot remove the primary file groups, primary data file or a log file, and I cannot rename these primary file groups or I cannot rename the MSDB database. Similarly, I cannot set the MSDB database to be offline, and I cannot set the primary file group of MSDB to be read-only. Now we move on with the third system database, which is a model database. And actually, as I have previously explained that model database is actually used as a template to create a new database in SQL Server. And it is possible to create user objects in the model database, but the thing that you need to keep in mind is that if you create user objects in the model database, then after doing this, every new database will be created with those user objects. And obviously, this is something that you would not like to happen. So, it's a good DBA practice to revoke access from the end users that they should be able to create anything within the model database. All the newly created databases that are created based on the model database, they use the same recovery model as it is the recovery model of the model database. And if you modify the model database, all database that would be created afterwards will inherit those changes. And regular users by default they cannot access the model database, but if they need to access the model database, keep in mind that user will also have the same permissions for any other database. And this is the reason that you should be very careful if you are granting your end users to create objects within the model database. Another very important thing in the context of model database is that the temp database. I'm coming to the temp database after I discuss the model database. But database is also created using the model database as a template. So keep in mind that any object that you create in the model database, it will also be available in the temp database when the SQL Server instance restarts, as temp DB is created each time the SQL Server instance is restarted. Oops. As far as the permissions are concerned, regular users by default cannot access the model database. But if they have access to the model database, then you have to keep in mind that those users will also have the same permissions on all the new databases that would be created using the create database statement. As far as backups are concerned, usually changes in the model database only occur when a customization is performed. And when any of these changes occur, it is recommended to perform a backup of the model database. And alternately, you can have regular backups for the model database as a part of your backup procedure for the SQL Server. By default, your model database will not. By default, your model database will not allow. Will also have. Will not allow access to the system objects within the model database to the end users. So you have to grant access to your end users so that they could access the system, the model database. Before discussing the restrictions for the model database, I will again go back to the what is happening with my screen. Let me go back to my SQL Server Management Studio, which is this one. And now let's execute the same thing for the MS, for the model database. So we see what happens when we try to drop the model database. So if I say drop database model, and I say execute, so it will not allow me to drop the model database. Similarly, if I try to set the database to be offline, again, it will not allow me to do so. So if I say alter database model set to offline, I cannot set my model database to be offline. Similarly, if I try to rename the model database, it will also not allow me to do so. So if I say alter database model, modify name, and I call it new model. And if I try to do so, you can see that it is not allowing me to model my database. Similarly, if I try to do the change data capture, so I will copy paste this statement from here. So step number one, if I try to change the database owner for the model database, it will allow me not to do so. So I cannot change the owner of any of these system databases. And if I try to enable the change data capture, again, it will not enable me to do the change data capture on the database. And if I try to change the file group, this is something that we have not done before. So let me change the file group for a database, model database. So if I say alter database model, and I say add file group, and I call my file group to be, let's set it to Scanry. I'm trying to modify the Scanry file group, and it does not allow me to modify the file group of my SQL Server database. Similarly, if I try to change the collation of my model database, it will also not allow me to do so. So let me go here, and I will try to change the database collation for the model database. And you see that I cannot change the database collection for model database. One thing that I would do is that I will create, I will try to create some object in the model database, and then see what will happen when I create a new database. So if I say create table, and let me take the DDL for this. So what I'm doing here is that let me set the context to the model database. So what I'm doing here is that I'm creating a table in the model database. So if I go here, to the tables. This is the test table that I created, and then I will put some values in the test table. So this is my DML statement that I'm running, and if I try to query my test table, I'm able to get the records that I have created here. So what I will do now is that I will create a new database, user database here, and I will call it, I have a database called Bike Stores. So I will call this database as Bike Stores 1. So I go here and I create a database, Bike Stores 1. For some reason, it's not creating the database. Interesting. Okay. Actually, I am using the model database, so there is an exclusive lock on the model database. And this is the reason that it is not able to create a database. So I have to change my context to the model database so that the exclusive lock is dropped from the model database. And then I will be able to create my database. So I call it Bike Stores 1. And now my database is created. So what I've done here is that I have just created my Bike Stores database. And I have not created any object within this database. But if I open this database and I go to tables, you see it contains dbo.test table. Now I have not created any object in the test table, any database object within the test table. What has happened is that I had created this table in my model database, and since model database is used as a template for creating the Bike Stores 1 database, this is the reason that the object that was created in the model database has been inherited in the Bike Stores 1 database. And if I try to query this object in my Bike Stores 1 database, I will be able to do so. You just need to set my context to the Bike Stores database. And now my database context is being set. So I will query or not to the Bike Stores, sorry, Bike Stores 1. I need to set my context to Bike Stores 1 database. And then I need to write test table. And when I query it, I'm able to see the contents that are available in here. So I'm reverting back to my presentation to discuss the restrictions with the model database. And more or less, you can see that the restrictions of each system database are more or less similar to each other. Again, with reference to the model database, I cannot change the database collation. I cannot change the database owner. I cannot drop the database. I cannot enable the change data capture on it. Model database cannot be part of a mirroring solution, and I cannot either rename the database or the primary group or remove the primary group. And I cannot set the database model to be offline and this. Now we move to the most important database in the context of system databases, and this is called the temp database. So what happens with the temp database is that it is a global resource that is available to all the users that are connected to the instance of SQL Server. Temporary user objects that are explicitly created, they are created in the temp database, and they include global or local temporary tables and indexes, your temporary stored procedures, table variables, table returned in table value functions and clusters. Internal objects that a database engine creates in the temp database, they include your work tables, your work files, and your intermediate sort results for different operations that you perform, for example, in the case of group by, order by, or your union queries. Um, your work tables are used to store intermediate results for spools, for your cursors, for the TSQL sorts that you are doing, and also for the temporary large objects that are created. And your work files are used for hash join or hash aggregate operations. Another thing that is held in the temporary system database are your version stores, and these are collection of data pages that hold the data rows that supports features from for row versioning. The temp database is used by all databases belonging to the entire SQL Server instance, and its context is destroyed each time the system is restarted. The temp database is also created from the model database, and since tempdb is recreated each time you restart the SQL Server instance, therefore it is not a recommended practice. You cannot take the backup of the temp database, and you also cannot restore the temp database because it is used as a kind of temporary storage. Um, there is one thing that you need to remember, and that is that it uses the temp database. It uses optimistic concurrency, and the temp database is heavily used by the SQL Server. And for this reason, you need to make sure that the size of your temp database is large enough to provide a space for all these database operations that are occurring. Now, since SQL Server 2016, temp database is getting so critical that at the time when you install SQL Server, there is a special screen that appears for temp database, and this is the screen that is used for the temp database. And I'm sure that many times people actually forget about this. They only see the server configuration and they do not go to the temp database. I would suggest that when you are creating an instance of the SQL Server, it is very important to look into the temp database. And and you will be here in the database engine configuration, and then you have to go to the temp database at the time of installing SQL Server to find out what are the parameters that are used in the SQL Server. At the time when the SQL Server would be installed, this page would be auto-populated at the time of SQL Server installation. And the things that are very important here are the temp DB data file and the temp DB log file. Within temp DB data file, the important parameters are number of the files, and these number of files actually are related to the number of your logical processors. Normally, it can range from 2 to 8, but this was a big SQL Server installation that I was doing. So here we had around 8 logical processors, so that's why the size is set to 8. The initial size of the temp database is 8 megabytes, and so since there are 8 files and each file is 8 megabytes, so 8 times 8 is 64, so the total size is 64. And the temp database data files can auto grow to 64 MB, And since there are 8 database temp DB data files that can auto grow to 64, so 64 times 8 is 512. And this is the location where your data files are located. Similarly, in the case of temp DB log file, the initial size is again 8 MB and it can auto grow to 64 MB. And this is the place where your log files are located. It is generally a good practice that you have a dedicated drive for your data file and log file. And sometimes some DBAs do not allow auto growth of the temp DB data file or the auto growth of temp DB log file. But Microsoft recommends that it is a good practice to set the auto growth for your temp DB data file and also the temp DB log file, because depending upon the different OLAP or OLTP workloads that are running in a specific instance of a SQL Server, the size of the operations, the amount of operations happening in SQL Server can grow. So therefore, the size of the temp DB data file and size of the temp DB log file really matters in this case. Again, if we go to the different restrictions in the temp DB database, so you can see that again, you cannot set the temp DB database to be offline. You cannot set the primary file groups of temp DB database, and similarly different views or triggers that are created with the encryption option. Since the encryption key is tied with the objects that are created in the database, so encrypted objects in the temp DB database can only be used in temp DB. Furthermore, you cannot enable the change data capture on temp database. Similarly, you cannot change the collation of database collation of temp DB database. You cannot change the database owner of the temp database. Normally, the temp database is owned by DBO. And similarly, you cannot your temp DB cannot be part of any of the mirroring solutions. There is one thing that is very important that I would like to give you a demo of. That is the objects that are used in the temp DB database. For example, if you are creating any temporary objects in your SQL Server, then those temporary objects are actually stored in the temp database. For example, if I am creating any temporary object in the bike stores database, so let me set my database context to bike stores and I execute this. Now let me create a table in the bike store database. And here you can see that before this table name, I have used the hash sign. So this means that this is a temporary table that is created. So although I am executing this statement in the context of bike stores database, this temporary object would be created in the temp database. So if I go here and I execute this, and if I go to my temp database under temporary tables, and here you can see that this temp person table is created. And similarly, I can perform insert operations on my temporary table. So here I am doing some insert operations in my temporary table. And then if I try to query the temporary table, I will be able to get the results that are created. One thing that you should remember is that this temp table is, or this table that is created in the temp database, it is appended by this unique number. And the reason for doing this is that it can also happen that there are several programmers that are writing TSQL code in your SQL Server instance, and they might create the temp table, different temp tables. So in order to create a uniqueness between the different user objects, what SQL Server do is that it assigns this unique number to the append this unique number to the name of your temporary table so that it can uniquely identify it. Similarly, it is also possible to create a and this temporary table is only relevant for this session. Once this session is over, this temporary table will also be deleted by the SQL Server. On the other hand, if I create a global temporary table, and then that temporary table will not be deleted by the end of the session. For example, I'm creating a global temporary table here, and you can see that this global temporary table is prefixed with two ampersand, two hash operators. And let me insert the values in my global temp table. These are the DML statements that I'm executing, and then I'm querying my global temporary table, and here I can see the object. And if I refresh my temp database and I go to the temporary tables, here you can see that I have created a global temporary table. Now the interesting thing that you should see here is that my global temporary table is not appended by anything, because this table can only be created once and it is global for all the sessions. So all the users that would be using this table, they will use it with by calling it in the select statement with the name of the table that has two hash signs in the beginning. And this table will remain there until all the active sessions that are queuing this table are remain active. Once all the sessions are inactive, or once all the sessions have completed and the SQL Server instance is restarted, then this temporary table will also be disabled, will also be dropped. I go back to my presentation. So again, as with the other databases, these are some of the restrictions that I have explained with the TempDB. Now we move to the very interesting database that is called Resource System Database. And Microsoft has introduced a new database that is called MS SQL System Resource. And this database was first introduced in SQL Server 2005. And if you look into the SQL Server, you will not be able to see this database. For example, if I go to instance of my SQL Server, you can see that I cannot see the resource database, because this resource database is a database that is hidden from the user. So it is not possible to view the resource database. And if I query my syscat tables, for example, I'm querying my sys database tables. Sys database DMV. So if I query my sys databases DMV, you can see that I can only see the 4 system databases: master, TempDB, model DB, MSDB, and 2 of the user databases that are created. So what I have to do in order to view my resource database is that I have to query the sysalt files. And in sysalt files, I have to use the DB ID of 32767. And 32767 is the DB ID for a resource database. I set my context to the master database, and when I execute this statement, here you can see that I can find the location of my resource database. This is the location of the data file for my resource database, and this is the location for my log file for my resource database. Coming back to my presentation, this is a database where the definition of all your programmable system objects are stored, such as your stored procedures, your system functions, and all the data definitions for your new metadata views. This includes the compatibility views such as sys databases and sys objects, as well as directory views like sys.databases and sys source partitions. And for the practical reasons, this database is read-only and is hidden from the end users. Now, what was the need for resource database before SQL Server 2005? If you want to upgrade SQL Server, then all the objects must be, all the system objects had to be deleted, and they had to restore at the time of upgrade. And this was a very time-consuming process. And if the installation for one of the objects fail, it will create a big issue for the whole installation. And to address this issue, resource database was introduced in SQL Server 2005 and onwards. This resource database expedites the upgrade process and makes the installation tasks easy. And since all the system objects, they reside under the resource database, so during the upgrade, we can just overwrite the resource database files with the new resource database files that are part of your current upgrade. And in short, a new database is simply, new resource database is simply copied, and it replaces the original resource database. And this is the reason that the upgrade process is now much more straightforward as compared to the way the upgrades were done to the SQL Server instance before the version SQL Server 2005. And the resource database, the location of the resource database, it may vary from different versions of the SQL Server. And the database ID for the resource database is 32767, irrespective of the version of the SQL Server that you are using or the edition of the server you are using. And you have to query this DMV called sys.sysort file to find out the location of the data file and log file of the resource database. Now I'm in the end, I'm coming to the another sixth important system database, and this is called the distribution database. Normally, you will not see the distribution database in every system. You will only be able to see the distribution database on a SQL Server that is either running as a publisher slash distributor or only running as a remote distributor. So this is much more relevant in the context of SQL Server application, whether it is a transactional application or a merged application. The distribution database stores metadata and history data for all types of application and transactions for transactional application. And the default name for the distribution database is called distribution. But at the time when you are creating your distribution database, you have the opportunity to change the name of the distribution database and assign a name that is more relevant for your case. And you have to remember that each publisher is linked to a single distribution database, and it identifies changes to the articles on each of its publishers and sends the change data to the subscribers. Publisher is that SQL Server database on which you have your publication database available, for which your objects for the articles for your publication are created. The data change information is stored in the distribution database until all subscribers have been synced and the retention period is expired. So this is in the context of a transactional server application. So if you see this part, you can see that at the time when you are creating a distributor, you are installing the distribution database. At this time, it is giving you the default name as distribution, and if you accept this name, then the database would be called distribution. And it is also possible to assign any other name if you don't like the name of a distributor. Similarly, this is the place where your distribution database files, data file will be created, and this is the location where your log file would be created for the distribution database. And you can change this location depending upon your settings at the time of installation. So if we talk about, in the next summary, if we talk about what we have discussed today, we have discussed about the master database, and master database, it stores all the system level information. And this is the database that is considered by the SQL Server each time the SQL Server is starting up. Therefore, if you do not have a backup of a SQL Server database, SQL Server master database, then you will not be able to restart your SQL Server. And it is recommended to have a regular backup of the database. In terms of MSDB, what we have learned is that MSDB is also called the SQL Server Agent Database, and it is responsible, primarily it is responsible for keeping track of the scheduling jobs and alerts for the SQL Server Agent. Besides this, it also keeps the history of the your backups, restores, service broker, database mail, and job alerts. And it is only database that has some predefined roles that are available. And it is also recommended to take a regular backup of the MSDB database. And by default, the recovery model of simple data, the MSDB database is set to simple. Model database is used as a template for creating new databases. And what we have also learned is that whenever SQL Server starts, it creates a temp database from the model database. Therefore, the model database must always exist on the server. And by default, the recovery model of recovery mode of model database is set to full recovery. About TempDB, what we have learned is that SQL Server uses TempDB each time to store the user objects, internal objects, and different versions. And since SQL Server 2016, TempDB was so important that at the time of installation of SQL Server, it provides you a dedicated screen to do different configurations for your TempDB database. Since TempDB database is created each time a SQL Server starts, therefore TempDB database is the only database in SQL Server that is not backed up, and it cannot be restored as well. As far as the resource database is concerned, what we have learned is that SQL resource database was introduced in SQL Server 2005, and system objects primarily they are physically stored in the respective database in the resource database, but they logically appear in the sys database. And this was something that I wanted to give you a demo of. For example, in the context of my bike store database, if I try to execute this query, I need to set my context to the database. I say bike stores. Oh, sorry, this is the wrong instance. This is the wrong instance. I need to set it here. So I'm querying my sys objects that are available in the bike stores database. So if I query this, you can see that all these sys objects, actually they are residing in the resource database, but logically they appear in the context of the database where it is where they are queried. And here I am querying them in the context of my bike stores database. So coming back to my presentation, if we talk about Azure SQL databases that are in the Azure cloud, for Azure SQL database and Azure SQL database with Elastic Pool, you only have a master database and temp database. The model database and MSDB database does not exist in Azure SQL or Azure SQL Elastic Pool. And this is the reason that in Azure SQL database, you do not have SQL Server agent because MSDB database does not exist. In the case of Azure SQL managed instance and Azure SQL running on a virtual machine, you have master database, model database, temp database, and resource database. And here, if I can show you, here you can see that this is a SQL database that I'm running on a virtual machine that is created in the Azure cloud. So if I go to my all resources, so here you can see that this is the Azure SQL VM that I am running. And on this Azure SQL VM, I have installed the SQL Server version 2022. And on this version of SQL Server, actually I'm running this all these queries. So this is a Azure SQL database that is running on a virtual machine. And in this case, I have all my databases, system databases that are available. So this was all from my side. If you have any queries, then please let me know. Arthur is saying that is this webinar being recorded? Yes, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording of this webinar would be uploaded to the Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community YouTube channel. So this was all from my side. Let me know if you have any queries, and I'm still not able to see any queries in the chat window. But anyway, if you do not have any queries, then thank you very much for today's session. I will post this recording of this session on the Microsoft Azure Pakistan Community YouTube channel, and I will also send an email to all the participants so that they could go to the recording and they can actually look at it. So thank you very much for today, and have a very nice weekend. Thank you very much.